Hi, I'm Bruce Pattinson from the Total Education Centre. I hope you enjoyed today's lecture, and don't forget that these lectures are brought to you free. So if you give us a like, that'd be great, and don't forget, if you have any questions or any queries, click on the button below, write me a question, and we'll surely get back to you as quickly as possible. Don't forget, if you're a subscriber to our channel, you can get to select the videos that you want to have made, and if you really need some extra help, don't forget, go to our website, because on the website you have all the student notes and teacher notes for the topics that I'm lecturing on. These lectures are only in addition to those, and they'll give you all the detail that you require to do well in your studies. Thanks for watching, and we hope you enjoy the video. Hello and welcome to this lecture on Yeats. This lecture is our introductory lecture, and we're going to be looking at some of Yeats's context and some of the ideas behind the module, critical study, and just a few general tips about Yeats to get you started on your study. In later lectures we'll be looking very specifically at some student questions, but we'll also be looking at very specific poems and analyses of those poems as Yeats wrote them. I'd like to start off by reminding you that the critical study is the module where you actually have to know all aspects of the text as it relates to a concept. You must develop your own response to the text, and that's extremely important, and I can't emphasize that enough. Your own response, and to be able to defend how you see the ideas in that text and how it all comes together, and the unity of the text. And you need to think very carefully as you move forward about how you're going to do that. And some of the questions that I answer in the student question relate to that very specifically, but it also, you need to remember that critics are critics, and you can use those critics, but you don't have to believe everything they say. I'd like to talk minimally about Yeats and his sort of early life, but I'd like to mention at this point that when you go into the text and look at it very clearly, into the different poems, a lot of the critics are going to relate it to Maud Gonne consistently. You don't need to give the marker the whole Maud Gonne story and the background and little biography of her life. You need to make sure it's very relevant, and the things that you mention are relevant to her. And I'll show you how to do this in a little while. Yeats, basically, I just put my glasses on to get this work going. Yeats was born in 1865, and so his life encapsulated a very dramatic period of time. Ireland was especially in turmoil during that period of time, and that's where his nationalism and the Fenian stuff comes out in that. And he uses the countryside in his early settings of the poem. And I'll return to that later about the use of nature in those poems. His work was basically immersed in his Irish heritage, but as I say later, it expands out into more universal themes and talks about the human condition, as all poetry does. I suppose it's a bit of a cliche really, but that's what Yeats does. He certainly was involved with nationalism. He was encouraged in the Fenian work by John O'Leary. Maud Gonne joined that movement later on, as we all know. And most of his early love poems are devoted to Maud Gonne, and I think that's pretty much a given. Throughout his life, Yeats became deeply involved in the Irish independence movement, and that influenced his poems in a very special way. He promotes the Irish and the Celtic works through his poetry. Some of his works also focus on political issues, such as Easter 1916, one of the set poems that we'll be studying. And his life was influenced by the many friends he had killed and imprisoned in that movement. Yeats lived out of Ireland for a lot of his life, in fact, but later kept returning, and certainly Wild Swans at Cool shows that he was sort of a regular type person. He dabbled in fascism in the 1930s, but later rejected that, and eventually he became an Irish senator and became deeply involved in the nationalism through political purposes. And we always see that his interests and feelings for the Irish countryside show through in that work of his. Each of the poems, when I do the individual poems, I'll look at the very specific context of those, but that gives you a bit of an overview of Yeats and the sort of things that he's interested in. What I would like to emphasise at the moment is that when you talk about Yeats's context, You figure very, very briefly, and you just mention things that are important to the context without giving a giant history. So, for example, if we're talking, say, Wild Swans at Cool, we could say something like a paragraph. From 1896, Yeats stayed each summer at County Galway in the locality of Gort and Kiltartan. First it was at Tirlua Castle with the Martins, and from 1897 to 1919 he stayed each summer at Cool House, the home of his friend and patron, Lady Augusta Gregory. And that's where the two poems, An Irish Airman, comes from, and Wild Swans at Cool. And that's the sort of contextual information that you'll need to develop to be in that very, very closely. And you need to just have very brief, short paragraphs such as that one to introduce the context and where it was going and why it was going. So let's have a look very, very quickly now at some of the main influence on Yeats's style. Yeats was influenced by 19th century Romanticism, poets such as Shelley, Keats, Tennyson, Arnold and Browning. His early poems are very gentle, delicate, and in some ways very dreamy. And he uses the word dream a lot in the poems. Even in the later years, he keeps going back to the idea of dreaming. And he uses predominantly adjectives and description to move forward in that. Another common technique that he uses is the use of refrain and the cumulative effect of those refrains and the repetition of certain things, especially some of his images, which we will look at when we look at the specific poems. He employs a lot of contrast with the tension of opposites, and he certainly is the master of the interrogative. He leaves lots of questions, characteristically rhetorical, and it leaves the reader pondering about what happens. But he's also at the same time asking himself what's going on there. He often poses philosophical or political problems in the poems, and through those questions tries to work out resolutions to those. Yeats enjoyed the sound of words, so when you read the poems out aloud, you'll hear that resonance in them. And of course, he repeats his symbols. The places, the tower, the winding stairs, the lake at Cool, all those sorts of things are repeated predominantly throughout the poems. He sets scenes economically, often not describing in great detail, but creating an atmosphere. And often he'll circularity is a technique in the poem. He'll go back to the beginning and make sure that refrain is repeated constantly. He also has an extraordinary variety of voice, which I think is very important in the poetry. And so the poems, as you study them, you'll find there are different voices and none of them get very boring. What we need to look at very carefully before we understand Yeats thoroughly is the symbolism of Yeats. And I'm going to talk about some of those symbols that he uses. Yeats had a great thirst for knowledge, and he read and researched very widely, and he was interested in very specific symbols across the occult, across the political. So for example, the swastika is a symbol that he uses, the yin and yang is a symbol that he uses. And during the study of these and in his research into the mystical, he noticed that the symbols were not a new idea, and they'd been studied and used throughout time. And he picks up on this idea and develops it a lot. And he researched back and found that many of the symbols that we use today were symbols in ancient cultures. And he developed that idea in his poetry. He believed particularly in the power of symbols, particularly traditional symbols. And he really liked the idea of the fact of the collective consciousness, and you'll see that come through in the poem. And he said, whatever the passions of men have gathered about becomes a symbol of great memory. So he really thinks that idea of collective consciousness is really important. When you study the poems, you'll notice these symbols keep going, and you might find it a little bit complex at first, but you'll be able to work through that. One of the symbols that he was really struck on was the great wheel, and I can't explain that in great detail in this very short lecture, but you'll find it written out very conclusively in the teaching and the student notes at the website. So if you go there and get those units, you'll find that information in greater detail and explained far more clearly than I can now. It's quite a complex idea, but he uses symbols such as gyres and the great wheel to communicate his ideas. The great wheel consists of 28 spokes, and you really need to see a picture of it, and in the notes that I supply you'll have that. Yeats believed that the world history worked in 2,000 year cycles, with the start of the current cycle being the birth of Christ. and that you'll see relates to different poems later on. The middle of the cycle, about 1000 AD, was when the cycle's at a peak. According to Yeats, the peak of this was Byzantium, and you see that in the poems. We're not studying those poems, so you don't need to do that. And the end of it is the Second Coming, the poem that we'll finish our studies by looking at particularly. The gyres are very important. They're like a reverse cylinder that spins in that sort of way, and this can be the widening and the narrowing of history and time. And you'll find that time is very important in Yeats's poetry. He believes that these gyres of rotating antithetical and primary time are intersected, and he uses them to explain personality, the natures of period and histories, the occurrence of events, and all those sorts of things. So they're things that you need to examine and to look at in great detail. Overall, Yeats's poetry has a lot to offer, and I think you'll find a critical study of Yeats's poetry a very interesting thing to do. Not only do you have all those philosophical and intellectual remnants, but you have actual factual history, like in Easter 1916. Yeats knew those people and developed relationships with those people. So they're also very personal poems as well as being philosophical. And you'll find that they range over a broad number of ideas, and I think that's what makes Yeats a very interesting poet, and certainly one that's studied. Well, that's the end of our brief introduction into Yeats, and of course there's much more of that, and we'll look at all of the individual poems. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.